17-year-old Sarah stared out of her bedroom window as the soft morning breeze moved the curtains. Ever since the accident that left her paralyzed 2 years ago, her days started the same way. Silent, still, and distant. The vibrant colors of the garden outside seemed unreachable, and the once lively house now felt like a shell of its former self. Her wheelchair felt more like a cage, and her father, David, with all his well-meaning attempts to cheer her up, only made her feel more suffocated. She avoided conversation, retreating further into her own quiet world. David, a practical man and widower since Sarah was 5, struggled with the overwhelming helplessness of seeing his daughter withdraw from life. Sleepless nights became his new routine as he racked his brain for a way to bring even the smallest hint of joy back into Sarah's life. One morning, an idea struck him. He drove to the local animal shelter, unsure but determined to try something new. Among the many animals, a golden retriever puppy caught his eye. The little dog, with its bright eyes and boundless energy, seemed like the perfect fit, a spark of life and hope in a tiny, furry package. When David walked into Sarah's room with the puppy in his arms, she looked up, her expression shifting between surprise and skepticism. "Dad, what's this?" she asked, frowning slightly. David set the puppy on the floor, and immediately, the little dog bounded over to Sarah, wagging its tail furiously. Without hesitation, the puppy placed its front paws on her lap and rested its head there, as if it instinctively knew this was where it belonged. Sarah hesitated but then reached out, her hand brushing against the soft fur. A small smile, her first in years, crept across her face. "What's his name?" Sarah asked, her voice softer now. "Buddy," David replied with a gentle smile. "That's the name they gave him at the shelter. But if you want to change it, you can." Sarah looked down at the puppy, now fast asleep on her lap. "No," she said quietly. "Buddy suits him." Over the next few days, Sarah's routine began to change. She spent hours watching Buddy explore the garden, clumsily tripping over his own paws and running back to her as if eager to share his adventures. For the first time in 2 years, laughter echoed through the halls of the house. Sarah started talking to Buddy as though he were an old friend, sharing secrets and hopes she hadn't voiced in years. David, watching from a distance, felt a flicker of hope for the first time in what seemed like forever. But what David couldn't have predicted was that Buddy wasn't just a playful distraction. The little dog was about to change Sarah's life in ways no one could have imagined. The morning sun poured through the kitchen windows as David brewed his coffee. From the living room, he could hear Sarah giggling, a sound he hadn't heard in years. Buddy was at it again, clumsily chasing his tail before flopping onto the floor in defeat. David smiled, grateful for the small miracles the dog had already brought to their lives. But as he sipped his coffee, he couldn't shake a nagging feeling that there was something different about Buddy, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Later that afternoon, Sarah dozed off in her wheelchair by the window. Buddy, who had been resting at her feet, suddenly jumped up, ears alert. He began pacing the room, his tail stiff and movements purposeful. Then, without warning, he bolted out of the room and into the kitchen, barking loudly. David, startled, put down the book he'd been reading and rushed to see what was wrong. Buddy was tugging at his pant leg with surprising force, trying to lead him somewhere. "Buddy, what is it?" David asked, confused but willing to follow. The dog guided him back to Sarah's room, where she was still asleep, her head tilted to the side. Buddy ran to her, nudging her hand with his nose and barking softly. David frowned, stepping closer. That's when he noticed something unusual. Sarah's foot had moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the blanket. David froze. "Sarah," he called, his voice trembling. She stirred awake, blinking groggily. "What's going on?" she asked, looking at Buddy, who was now wagging his tail as if he'd just accomplished something extraordinary. "Your foot," David began, hesitant. "It moved." Sarah looked at him, her face a mix of disbelief and curiosity. "That's not possible, Dad," she said, shaking her head. But David couldn't let it go. The next morning, David found Sarah sitting with Buddy on the porch, a blanket draped over her legs. She was watching the dog intently as he sniffed around the garden. "Dad," she said hesitantly, breaking the silence. "I think Buddy knows something we don't." David raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "He's been acting different. Every time he's near me, I feel something. It's hard to explain, but it's like a tingling sensation in my legs. I don't think I'm imagining it." David sat beside her, his mind racing. Could the dog really be helping her in some way? It sounded absurd, yet there was no denying the tiny changes he had seen. "Maybe we should talk to a doctor," he suggested cautiously. Sarah nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "But I don't want them to take Buddy away. He's special." That night, as Sarah slept, Buddy curled up at her feet. David stood in the doorway watching them. The dog's devotion was undeniable, and for the first time, David allowed himself to wonder. Was Buddy more than just a companion? Was it possible he was the key to something miraculous? The next day, David and Sarah would take Buddy to the doctor, and what they discovered would leave them speechless. The following morning, David and Sarah arrived at the doctor's office with Buddy trotting happily beside them. The waiting room was quiet, filled with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. Sarah fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, her nerves evident. Buddy, sensing her unease, rested his head on her lap, his warm brown eyes gazing up at her as if to reassure her everything would be okay. Dr. Mason, a neurologist who had been following Sarah's case since her accident, greeted them with his usual calm demeanor. He raised an eyebrow at the sight of Buddy. "I see you've brought a new member of the family," he said, gesturing toward the dog. "This is Buddy," Sarah said, managing a small smile. He's been helping me feel things in my legs. At least, I think he has." Dr. Mason nodded thoughtfully, though his skepticism was clear. "Well, let's take a look and see what's going on," he said, motioning for Sarah to move to the examination table. David helped her transfer from the wheelchair while Buddy sat patiently by her side, his eyes following her every movement. During the tests, Dr. Mason conducted his usual evaluations, poking and prodding to assess Sarah's nerve responses. At first, there was nothing unusual. But then, as Sarah began describing the tingling sensations she'd felt when Buddy was near her, the doctor decided to try something different. He asked David to bring Buddy closer. The dog eagerly climbed onto the table, resting his paws near Sarah's legs. As Buddy sat there, something remarkable happened. Sarah gasped. "I feel that," she exclaimed, her voice filled with both shock and excitement. "It's like a vibration, right where his paws are." Dr. Mason's eyes widened, and he immediately repeated the test. With Buddy's presence, there was a faint but undeniable improvement in Sarah's nerve responses. It was subtle, but it was there. "This is unusual," Dr. Mason admitted, pulling off his gloves. "I've seen cases where emotional support animals improve a patient's mental health, but this is different. It's almost as if his presence is stimulating some kind of neurological activity." On the ride home, Sarah was quiet, her hand resting gently on Buddy's head. David glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his mind racing. He wanted to be hopeful, but he was afraid of raising her expectations too high. "What do you think, sweetheart?" he finally asked. "I think Buddy is a miracle," Sarah said softly, stroking the dog's fur. "I don't care how it's happening. I just know I feel something, and that's more than I've felt in 2 years." David couldn't argue with that. As they pulled into the driveway, he silently vowed to do whatever it took to support Sarah and Buddy in this journey, no matter where it led. But later that night, Buddy's behavior took another strange turn, leaving David wondering if there was more to this dog than they realized. That night, the house was quiet, with only the soft ticking of the living room clock breaking the silence. Sarah had gone to bed early, exhausted from the emotional day at the doctor's office. Buddy, as always, curled up at her feet, his eyes half closed but alert. David sat in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, his thoughts heavy. He couldn't stop replaying the moment at the doctor's office when Sarah had felt something. It defied logic, but he couldn't deny what he'd seen with his own eyes. Around midnight, David heard a sharp bark. It wasn't Buddy's usual playful yelp. It was urgent, demanding. He bolted upright, his heart pounding. The barking continued, and David rushed down the hallway to Sarah's room. When he opened the door, he saw Buddy pacing frantically around the wheelchair, his tail stiff and his ears pinned back. Sarah was sitting up in bed, looking confused and slightly alarmed. "Buddy, what's wrong?" David asked, stepping into the room. The dog ran to him, grabbed the sleeve of his shirt with his teeth, and began pulling him towards Sarah. David knelt beside her. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I think so," Sarah replied, though her voice trembled. "But my legs feel strange again. It's not just tingling. It's almost like pressure." She looked down at her legs, unsure of what was happening. Buddy jumped onto the bed, gently placing his paws on her lap as if trying to comfort her. The pressure seemed to intensify under his touch, and Sarah gasped. "I can feel more," she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad, I think something's happening." David's chest tightened. He watched as Sarah wiggled her toes. Both feet this time. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. His throat tightened with emotion as he grabbed her hand. "That's incredible, Sarah," he said, his voice shaking. "It's a huge step forward." Buddy wagged his tail furiously, his tongue lolling out as if he were celebrating with them. But just as the tension began to ease, Buddy's behavior shifted again. He barked sharply and jumped off the bed, running to the window. David followed him, drawing back the curtain. Outside, the night was still and calm, but Buddy continued to bark, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. "Do you think something's out there?" Sarah asked, her voice still shaky. David shook his head, trying to reassure her. "I don't know," he said, kneeling to pet Buddy. "But whatever it is, I think Buddy's trying to protect you." As the strange incidents continued, David began to suspect that Buddy's extraordinary instincts went far beyond mere coincidence, and they were about to discover just how special he truly was. The morning sunlight streamed into Sarah's room, casting a warm glow over Buddy as he lay curled at her feet. Sarah sat up in her bed, staring down at her legs, still processing the small but undeniable progress she had made the night before. David entered with a tray of breakfast, but his face was clouded with concern. He had spent most of the night replaying Buddy's strange behavior. Was it instinct, coincidence, or was there something more at work? "Morning, sweetheart," David said, setting the tray down. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Sarah replied, a faint smile crossing her lips. "But I can't stop thinking about Buddy. He knew something was happening with me last night. Dad, it's like he sensed it." David nodded, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I've been thinking about that too. There's something about Buddy that I can't explain. I'm not sure if it's luck, instinct, or something else entirely." That afternoon, David made a decision. He called the animal shelter where he had adopted Buddy, hoping to learn more about the dog's background. The woman on the other end of the line remembered Buddy immediately. "Oh yes," she said warmly. "Buddy came to us after being found near a rehabilitation center. The staff there said he used to roam the grounds and gravitate toward patients. They swore he had a way of sensing who needed help." David's pulse quickened. "Did they ever figure out why?" he asked. "Not really," the woman replied. "They just thought he was special. Some dogs have instincts that we can't fully understand." Hanging up the phone, David sat in stunned silence. Buddy wasn't just a dog. He had a history of helping people heal, and now he was doing the same for Sarah. It wasn't a coincidence. David felt a surge of hope mixed with awe as he realized that adopting Buddy might have been more than just good fortune. It might have been destiny. Back at home, Sarah was sitting on the porch with Buddy beside her. She was focused, her brow furrowed in determination. "Dad," she called as he approached. "Watch this." Slowly, Sarah leaned forward, placing her hands on the armrests of her wheelchair. Her legs trembled as she pushed against the floor with her feet. For a brief moment, she managed to lift herself just an inch off the seat before collapsing back down. David rushed to her side. "Sarah, that was amazing." he exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion. It was Buddy, she said, looking down at the golden retriever, who was wagging his tail furiously. He gave me the courage to try. That night, as Sarah slept, David sat in the living room with Buddy at his feet. He stroked the dog's fur, his thoughts racing. "You're more than just a dog," he whispered. "You're a miracle." But as Sarah's progress continued, a new challenge arose, one that would put both her and Buddy to the ultimate test. The days that followed were filled with hope and cautious excitement. Sarah's progress continued steadily, and each small movement brought renewed determination. Buddy was always by her side, his presence unwavering. However, as Sarah's strength grew, so did her resolve to push herself further. She began attempting small steps with the help of parallel bars in the living room, her arms trembling as she supported her weight. David watched with pride and worry, always ready to catch her if she faltered. One evening, as Sarah was practicing, Buddy barked sharply and ran to her side. Sarah laughed softly, looking down at him. "It's okay, Buddy. I've got this," she said, her tone reassuring. But as she moved forward, her hand slipped, and her balance wavered. In an instant, Buddy pressed against her legs, steadying her. David rushed over, his heart pounding. "Sarah, are you all right?" he asked, gripping her shoulders. "I'm fine, Dad," she said, breathless but smiling. "Buddy caught me. He's always there." That night, as David tucked Sarah into bed, she turned to him, her expression serious. "Dad, I want to walk again," she said firmly. "Not just take a few steps, I want to really walk. I know it won't be easy, but I feel like I can do it, especially with Buddy's help." David knelt beside her, his hands resting on hers. "You've already come so far, Sarah. If this is what you want, we'll do everything we can to make it happen," he promised. The next morning, Sarah's physical therapist arrived for their usual session. But this time, Buddy insisted on joining them. He trotted to the mat and sat beside Sarah, his eyes locked on her as if he knew what was about to happen. With the therapist's guidance, Sarah gripped the bars and took her first shaky step forward. Buddy walked alongside her, his nose gently brushing her leg, offering silent encouragement. As the session ended, Sarah turned to David, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm not stopping," she said. "Not until I'm walking on my own." David nodded, his chest swelling with pride. But deep down, he knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, and that Sarah and Buddy would need every ounce of strength they had to face them. Just as Sarah's confidence grew, an unexpected setback would test her resolve, and Buddy's unique bond with her, like never before. Progress had become the norm in Sarah's life, and each day brought a new achievement. Small steps turned into longer strides, and her strength seemed to grow in tandem with her bond with Buddy. But just as hope was becoming routine, an unexpected event threatened to unravel everything. One rainy afternoon, Sarah was practicing her walking when her foot slipped on the slick floor. She fell hard, the sound echoing through the house. David, who had been in the kitchen, rushed to her side. "Sarah, are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaking. Sarah groaned in pain, clutching her knee. Buddy was already there, his nose nuzzling her hand, his whimpers full of concern. "I'm fine," Sarah said through gritted teeth, though the tears in her eyes said otherwise. She tried to push herself up, but the pain was too much. David helped her into her wheelchair, his heart sinking as he saw the frustration etched on her face. For the rest of the day, Sarah was silent. She avoided Buddy's gaze and barely spoke to David. That night, as Buddy curled up at her feet, she whispered, "Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'll never walk again." Buddy nudged her leg gently, as if trying to remind her of how far she'd come. But the doubt in her heart was louder than his silent encouragement. The next morning, Sarah refused to practice. She stayed in her room, staring out the window as the rain drizzled down the glass. Buddy sat by her side, refusing to leave. David watched from the doorway, torn between giving her space and encouraging her to keep going. Finally, he knelt beside her and said, "Sarah, you've faced harder days than this. You've come so far not just because of Buddy, but because of you. Don't let one bad day take that away." David's words and Buddy's unwavering presence planted a seed of hope in Sarah. But the real breakthrough was yet to come, in a moment neither of them could have predicted. The next day, the rain continued to fall, casting a gray gloom over the house. Sarah remained withdrawn, her resolve seemingly broken. Buddy sat at her side, his head resting on her lap, as if refusing to let her spiral further into despair. David tried to encourage her to come out of her room, but Sarah just shook her head, her eyes fixed on the window. By mid-afternoon, the rain had turned into a light drizzle. Buddy suddenly stood up, his ears perking as he trotted to the door. He barked softly, then turned to look at Sarah, his tail wagging expectantly. Sarah sighed, her hand brushing his head. "Not today, Buddy," she murmured, but the dog barked again, more insistent this time. David, sensing Buddy's determination, stepped into the room. "I think he wants you to go outside," he said gently. When Sarah hesitated, he knelt beside her. "Just a few minutes. You don't have to do anything. Just sit on the porch and breathe some fresh air." Reluctantly, Sarah allowed David to wheel her to the porch, Buddy following close behind. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the air crisp and the ground wet with puddles. Buddy immediately bounded into the yard, barking and chasing imaginary prey. Sarah watched him with a faint smile, her mood lifting ever so slightly. And then, Buddy did something extraordinary. He trotted back to Sarah, a stick in his mouth, and dropped it at her feet. He barked once, looking up at her expectantly. "Buddy, I can't throw that," Sarah said, shaking her head. But Buddy didn't budge. He nudged the stick closer, barking again. David stepped forward, but Buddy growled softly, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "Fine," she said, rolling her eyes but with a hint of a smile. She leaned down, picked up the stick, and tossed it weakly into the yard. Buddy retrieved it instantly, bringing it back and repeating the process. Each throw seemed to chip away at Sarah's frustration. Finally, on the fifth throw, she stood up, gripping the porch railing for support, and tossed the stick farther. Buddy barked joyfully, racing to retrieve it. David stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice trembling. She turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise as she realized she was standing without help. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I'm standing, Dad. I'm standing." As Sarah took her first independent steps in years, the bond between her and Buddy proved to be more than just companionship. It was life-changing. But their journey wasn't over yet. Sarah stood on the porch, gripping the railing tightly, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Buddy sat a few feet away, his tail wagging furiously as if cheering her on. David stood nearby, his hands hovering slightly, ready to catch her if she faltered. But Sarah didn't want help, not this time. "I can do this," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Slowly, she shifted her weight onto her trembling legs. Her feet moved forward, one hesitant step after another, her hands brushing the railing for balance. Buddy barked encouragingly, running ahead and back as though guiding her. David's chest tightened as he watched his daughter take steps she hadn't taken in over 2 years. Sarah paused, catching her breath. Her legs felt weak, but the determination in her heart burned stronger. "Just a few more steps," she said, forcing herself to move forward. Each footfall seemed to echo with years of frustration, pain, and hope finally coming together in this one moment. By the time she reached the end of the porch, tears streamed down her face. "Sarah, you're amazing," David said, his voice cracking with emotion. He stepped forward to steady her, but she held up a hand. "No, Dad, I need to do this," she said firmly. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned back toward the porch steps. Buddy walked alongside her, his body close enough to provide support but far enough to let her lead. As Sarah reached the steps, she looked down at them with uncertainty. "I can't." "Not yet," she said, her voice faltering. Buddy barked and nudged her hand, his eyes full of encouragement. David knelt beside her. "Sarah, it's okay. You've already done so much today. We can take it one step at a time, literally, Sarah nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. With David's help, she eased herself back into her wheelchair. But instead of feeling defeated, she looked at Buddy and smiled. "Tomorrow," she said softly, stroking his fur. "Tomorrow, I'll go farther." As Sarah began to reclaim her independence, an unexpected visitor arrived, bringing news that would reveal just how extraordinary Buddy truly was. The next morning, Sarah was back on the porch, Buddy by her side. Her determination was stronger than ever, and even the faint ache in her legs felt like a badge of progress. David watched proudly from the doorway, marveling at how much had changed since Buddy had entered their lives. However, their morning routine was interrupted by the arrival of an unfamiliar car pulling into the driveway. A middle-aged woman stepped out, clutching a folder. Her expression was warm but serious as she approached the house. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady but kind. "I'm Evelyn Martin, and I work with the rehabilitation center near the animal shelter where you adopted Buddy." She extended a hand to David, who shook it cautiously. Sarah glanced at her father, unsure of what this visit meant. "Is something wrong?" David asked, his brow furrowed. "No, not at all," Evelyn assured him. "In fact, I'm here because of Buddy. I've been following his story since he first appeared at the rehab center. He was never officially part of our therapy program, but his instincts were remarkable. Patients responded to him in ways we couldn't explain. He seemed to know exactly what they needed, whether it was emotional comfort or physical stimulation." Sarah listened intently, her gaze shifting to Buddy, who now sat quietly at her feet. Evelyn continued, "When he disappeared one day, we were devastated. We thought we'd lost him for good. But it seems he found his way to where he was needed most. Right here." David looked at Sarah, his eyes misty. "He's been more than a companion," David said. "Since Buddy arrived, Sarah has made progress we thought was impossible. He's changed our lives." Evelyn nodded, her smile growing. "I'm not surprised. We've seen patients make miraculous recoveries when he was around. I don't know how to explain it, but Buddy seems to sense things on a deeper level. He's more than just a dog. He's a healer." That evening, after Evelyn left, Sarah sat with Buddy on the porch, stroking his fur. "You've always known, haven't you?" she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Buddy wagged his tail, leaning into her touch. She looked up at the sky, the fading sunlight casting a golden glow over the yard. "You didn't just change my life, Buddy. You gave it back to me." Buddy wasn't just a dog. He was a miracle, a healer, and a friend who had walked into their lives at the moment they needed him most. For Sarah, every step she took was a testament to the bond they shared, a bond that no one, not even science, could fully explain.